Hi, hello, my name's Ollie Bliss and this is my channel BookDraw. For those who don't know, I enjoy looking at queer fiction and occasionally I create images out of the stuff that I've been reading. Today I'm doing a wrap-up for March. It has been one epic month. I have done a ton of reading. I feel very proud of myself. I've actually contributed to 2 readathons this month in terms of just reading books, so I'll kick off with those first. I have got other books and I've done a separate video about this and I will continue to read those across the year, but I just wanted to make sure that I'd at least read one in March and I chose this one and I think I did a good choice, quite frankly. So Middle Grade March is hosted by Krista from BooksAndJams and Katie from Life Between Words. So, and I heard about this from Bookie Laura, so thank you very much for that. This focuses on 2 characters. There's Stagger Lee and Trout. It's like 114 pages. It took me only like an hour or so to read through this one, so it's perfect for a middle grade read in terms of just getting something that is going to encourage a young person to read. I did feel right at the beginning for the first sort of 20 pages, it was a little bit slow and clunky, and I was just kind of like, oh, if I was a kid reading this, I'm not sure if I would want to carry on. But there is a bit of a mystery which is hooks you in right at the beginning. So as long as you are curious enough about why Stagger Lee is reeling from some sort of event or something that has happened to her, it's enough to get you in. So the 2 characters, Stagger Lee and Trout, obviously have these fun, quirky names. And that's because they've kind of claimed their own names for themselves. But the story focuses on Stagger Lee, whose mum is white and the father is black. And historically, the grandparents were famous. And that has kind of led to part of her identity being created for her. And so Stagger Lee is kind of like a separation of her own identity, but it's informed through the legacy of both her parents and her grandparents. And that's interesting when you compare it to Trout, who is calling herself Trout because she sees how a fish is pulled out of water and it fights for its life, and it's vigorous and just desperate to live and assert itself in its own way. And so she calls herself that to assert her identity. So you've got these 2 independent minds who are coming together, who are faced with sets of values which kind of clash with their own, and there is something between them that brings them together, and it's about that kind of sexual awakening and the shared identity of being slightly outside of what is the norm, for a better choice of the word. And I think particularly if you are from 10 to 16, it would be effective for that first initial exploration and insight to what it means to be your own person, really. The next one which I want to talk about is Emma Donoghue's Slammerkin, which I picked up for the Irish Readathon, which was done by Leanne Rose. She had done different challenges, and I just stuck to the first one, which was to read a female Irish author. And she had recommended Hood by Emma Donoghue, and then when I was looking into her, this Slammerkin had actually won an award for lesbian fiction, so I was like, I'm going to give that one a go, see how it goes. But surprisingly, the book wasn't necessarily explicitly about lesbian-related themes. It just happened to be written by a lesbian author. So I only discovered that right at the very end, because there are a couple of times when you could have been like, oh, okay, is this where this is going? And then it doesn't. It focuses on Mary as a lead character, and her sexuality isn't explicit, but basically as a young girl, age 14, she ends up having to leave home, and she has to defend herself and find her way through life by herself, and it's very, very tricky and very difficult to read because it's 17th century at the end of the 17th century, and you really feel for this character because she is very naive to the world, and but she is also quite feisty, and you root for her all the way through the course of the book. But it's based on some actual accounts which Emma Donoghue had found and researched. So on that side, it's really interesting to see this perspective. I was left reeling at the end of the story in terms of what actually happens to poor Mary, on the stuff that she actually goes through. And all the way through it, you are wanting to her to just be okay. And this book is just quite good at being quite brutal and revealing a lifestyle that was happening at that time in a very kind of open, frank way. And yeah, I wasn't expecting it, but it was really good, and it's made me want to read Hood. So I was really pleased to just read and discover that book for myself, and that's thanks to Leanne Rose, so thank you very much. The next one which I want to talk about is Panopticon, which is by Jenni Fagan, and this is a debut novel. What's interesting about her backstory is she actually grew up in care herself, and this is about the experiences of a 15-year-old girl called Amaze, and it's about her experiences in the care system. She's really quite vulnerable because if she messes up again and she becomes 16, she's treated as an adult, and that she's more than likely to end up in prison and in jail. And it's about her on that precipice, and from being this vulnerable 15-year-old girl who is just trying to make her way through life, but has had zero support, and you meet her where she's got blood on her skirt. Somehow there is a police officer who is in a coma, and they're kind of blaming her, and you are just following her kind of day-to-day life at that time. I was originally introduced to this book from watching a conversation with Simon Savidge and Kerry, I think her name was, and from their review of it, I was like, oh, this sounds really good. And it, like, I think for me, it might be a book of the year for me. I can see this being one of those books that really stays with me, and it felt like this book is really challenging in terms of revealing very open and frank conversations about what it's like to be this type of teenager who was experiencing a real range of issues, and they're all just thrown in there. I mean, it got to the point where it's like, God, can this girl go through anything else? Because it's one thing after another that happens to her. But the other side of it is she is constantly on drugs throughout the process of the story. You can't always separate truth and reality from what is fictional in her head and down to the drugs that she's been taking. But I can totally see the perspective of that and how she kind of uses storytelling and fairy tale to kind of save and protect herself, which I can remember from reading Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, and it's kind of that same device that is used to protect her identity and herself within a series of events which are really challenging for her, and it's how she kind of is making sense of the world in that environment. I just feel like if you've got teenagers who are going through some stuff you don't read, this would be an interesting read where they would feel like there is a relevant voice for them. The next one which I read, which I want to talk about, is complete opposite end of the spectrum, because this is focusing on an older woman's perspective, Jan Morris, who is a travel writer and a living author. She's in her 92nd year, I believe, from memory, from reading it. And the book is called In My Mind's Eye, but it's basically just a thought diary, and she doesn't distinguish by dates. She does it through days, and I think she kind of does about 6 months worth. And it's just her reflecting on what happens to her during the course of the day, things that are happening around her, and it's just really lovely. She kind of reflects back on some of her memories, and she talks about how that kind of changes over time. She talks about the treatment of animals, which she's very passionate about, and she also talks about principles of kindness, which are a reoccurring theme throughout the course of the book. And as a travel writer, you can tell that she has had a broad range of experiences where she's seen different societies, seen different political and religious structures, and she's removed herself from that, and she identifies as someone who's agnostic, who's a spiritual person, but doesn't really have a definitive answer on any of those things, but she is led by the principle of being kind. And that's just a really, really nice thing to read. And if you are just looking for a heartwarming, gentle comfort read, this is absolutely perfect. The next one which I want to talk about is Keeping You a Secret, which is by Julie Ann Peters. So this was done in 2003, and that's kind of the same time that I was at college, so I kind of immediately felt, oh, okay, I was there, I was at this time, because they refer to CD players, and I was kind of like, what, CD player? Is this? And I had to go back and find out exactly when it was written, because it kind of threw me for a second. I was like, oh, this is a bit out of date. So it's also dealing with sexuality at a time, early noughties, and it did just wake me up and remind me that we have moved on significantly now that we are in 2019. But basically, the lead character, Holland, is like the perfect student. She's doing really well academically. She's got herself together. She's got a boyfriend, and then Cece comes into the scene, and it kind of throws her out of kilt, and she's learning about her sexual identity through Cece, who's out and open, and she wants to set up an LGBTQIA support group. And as student president, she learns politically, like, not everybody around the table is on board with that idea. It then has repercussions across the school in terms of bullying events that happen, and it makes her think about her own sexual identity in a different way. I don't want to say too much, but what I would say, it's good in terms of having a voice which really goes through the process of what happens if a student is kicked out from their home and have to find their own feet. If the parents aren't supportive of them being a young queer person. And that is actually very useful in terms of the process that goes through of that. The next one which I want to touch on briefly is Reverent Gun, which is by Joon Ha Lee. So this is the third and final installment of Machineries of Empire, which I have been reading on and off, and it's the third and final book within that series. It has been mind-bendingly difficult process for me to just keep on top of and keep with, because the magical system and the political structure is quite convoluted, I would say. I definitely enjoyed the first book the most, but as long as you understand the structure of the politics and the magic system, it's a really brilliant, strategically, conceptually broad book, which is actually about like the outcomes of war and the toll it has on people and the impact both short and long term, because in the third book it's happening after this kind of magical societal structure has broken down and what it's been replaced with and what's the aftermath of that, but it's still attached to some of the lead characters and but looking at it from a different perspective. And I think because I mostly enjoyed the first book because I really liked the lead character, but by this third book, it's all become something slightly different. And because to tell you things would be to kind of reveal plot points from the other two books, so it feels quite challenging to discuss. But I do want to do a separate video which is just exploring the system. This is a universe which is very complicated and very dense. But if you understand it and you're on board with it, it is a brilliant, brilliant journey. This is top-end sci-fi stuff going on here, but it's very, very cool. The next one which I want to talk about is Giovanni's Room, which is by James Baldwin. Now, this is one which I have been meaning to read forever, and I really don't have much of an excuse. It's only like 150 pages long. And I have this copy, which is a second-hand first edition. So Giovanni's Room is about this guy called David, and he's in a relationship with Hella, and he's an American who's moved to Paris. They are at a crossroads in terms of thinking about should they get married and move their relationship forward. So she goes off to Spain, and he's gone to Paris, and they're having a little time apart. and it's about David's perspective of being in this new city, and he meets Giovanni, and he kind of enters into this gay scene, and David's sexuality isn't explicit. Like, you could just say that he's questioning, you could say that he's more bisexual because he's clearly sexually and physically attracted to Hella, but he is slightly obsessed with Giovanni. Giovanni's room is also a bit of a metaphor in terms of the physical room that he rents with Giovanni, and it becomes a paradise and a prison in terms of their relationship, and how it's kind of their own little world that they exist in. The book is actually touching on a lot of really interesting things in terms of the relationship between Hella and him. I really liked, because when she catches up with him, she has this conversation with him about how if she gets married to him, her life can start, and that she can start to live independently. And because this is set in the 1950s, I found that really interesting to read, in terms of, like, here is a man advocating in terms of the rights of other women, in terms of like them needing that independence and having to advocate for themselves for that. And David's character doesn't see what she's really talking about properly at that time. So I thought that was kind of really interesting. He is living a falseness with wanting to be with her because that's what he should want to progress on with, but also having this relationship with Giovanni, and every time he's confronted with actually revealing his emotions to any degree, he kind of shuts down and he doesn't talk, and he doesn't express himself. I thought it, like, the first half of it, I felt like, oh, I have read this before, and because it made me think of Dancer from the Dance, Swimming Pool Library, Buenos, Noches, Buenos Dias, and other kind of like gay, predominantly 1980s fiction, where it's talking about the underground night scene and meeting up with men and stuff. And I just was like, oh, I can't bear 150 pages of this. But then I had to remind myself that actually he had written this before all those other people, and this is 1950s, and he's kind of leading the way with this. So really, it deserves a moment just to read it on that level. And but then there's this argument towards the end, which is really visceral and so like heart-wrenching, and it just makes you really feel and empathize with the entire situation. It's very typical of that time period, and it made me think about Pulp and the American McCarthyism of that time, and Lavender Lads, in terms of politically and socially, anyone who was seen as a deviant could be seen as a communist, and so narratives around queer characters often ended either in a death or them ended up leading a heteronormative life, or committing suicide, or ending up in an asylum, a mental asylum. In this particular book, it goes down one of those routes, and I was wondering if that was more just because of the time and how it had to be published in a particular way. And it's interesting finding out that all the characters are white, and this is from a black writer, where there's only so many different things that can be tolerated. You had to do it from a white perspective, because this was dealing with sexual deviance, and for sexual deviance and black people all in one conversation was probably too much for the publishing industry, so it just had to focus on the one issue, which seems absurd now, but was what James Baldwin was facing at the time. So in terms of thinking about this as a piece of literature for its time, it's incredible, and I'm really glad that I finally have read it now and kind of understand why it's praised as such a brilliant piece of literature. For anyone who's stepping a toe into queer literature, definitely a good one to start with, because it was like one of those original voices, and it's a great and compelling read. Anyway, that's enough from me. I think these are all the books which I have read across this month. I feel like I've done pretty well this month in terms of my reads. I've read quite a nice rich range, it feels like. Let me know what you have been reading recently, and if you've done videos about your wrap-ups recently, please tell me down in the comments below. And I will see you all again real soon. Okay, take care, bye!